Yeah, let's go ahead. Okay. Yeah, my name is Nathaniel Isaacson. I'm an associate professor of modern Chinese literature and cultural studies at North Carolina State University. And the author of Celestial Empire, The Emergence of Chinese Science Fiction. So talking first about how I got interested in Chinese language and Chinese culture and literature in general. I think like a lot of people who grew up in like the 1980s, 1990s, I heard a lot about how China was an emerging superpower and an emerging sort of economic giant, right? And everyone was saying you can learn Chinese and go and do business. I didn't really know exactly what business was. And I think the more I found out about what business was, the less I was interested in any of that. But I did spend a year learning Chinese in the United States. And then I went and spent another year living in China. And I really just absolutely love being over there, seeing the culture, how old it is. You know, they have 5,000 years of tradition. It's a really beautiful language with so much breadth to it. And another thing that happened near the end was this was 1999, was the United States bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And so all of a sudden, a lot of people who I was friends with in China sort of became no longer my friends, or I couldn't see them for quite a while. And there was a lot of tension between the two countries. And really, it's continued ever since that day. But I thought, another thing I wanted to do, along with discovering I was more interested in the language, the culture, the literature, teaching, was I wanted to sort of try and bridge some of those gaps of misunderstanding between the United States and China. Um, so that's sort of where I really solidified my interest in the study of the language and the culture. I've always been a lover of literature, and so learning how to read in Chinese was another like really big motivator for me after having spent a few years learning the language. And I think for some reason, realizing that the language was so challenging just motivated me even more to work on it and to really want to get to that level of fluency that I could read literature. Um, as far as deciding to specialize in science fiction, when I started my PhD at UCLA, we were working on some late Qing Dynasty texts that my dissertation advisor had already written about. And it was in a book, and I really didn't know what else there was I could say for the graduate seminar on that and for writing some kind of a research paper. And I actually ended up with an incomplete in that class. And that turned into a failed grade for a while that you have to get replaced in the American university system. And eventually, the thing I realized was that there were a lot of elements of science fiction in what we were reading, especially in one novel, Xin Shi Tou Ji, or New Story of the Stone, that I write about in my book. And I started trying to figure out how I could approach Chinese science fiction and wondering if there was more science fiction out there. And the more I explored, the more I found that there was, quite a bit. So that was really amazing. I think as far as like the research question that developed for the dissertation and eventually for the book that emerged out of that was how to define science fiction, and if I can even say that something in Chinese is science fiction, especially at the turn of the 20th century. And so that was a really big part of it. And I think that discovering, what a lot of other people were writing about the relationship between colonialism and empire and science fiction's very deep concern with empire was something that I could really work well with, and that helped me figure out what the object of study was and how could I sort of delimit science fiction within the Chinese language. And so that's the core question that got me going, and I think the core question of the book is examining the relationship between empire and sci-fi in general, and wanting to, sort of say something back to Anglophone science fiction or Western science fiction, but also look at its role in Chinese science fiction. Um, yeah, I do think I ended up being very surprised by how much material was out there. The plan sort of initially, I think the other part, along with finding an interesting research question and finding something that other people weren't saying, was I thought that I would have just enough to write a dissertation, and the plan was always maybe very short-sighted, right? And a dissertation, I was told, had to be 5 chapters, and so it's like great, I can find sort of 5 novels or a few short stories and a few novels, and I'll have the dissertation, I'll be done, I'll have said everything there is to say. And as time has gone on, just more and more things have emerged. And I found out that even in the late Qing Dynasty, at the turn of the 20th century, was a very rich period, and there's quite a bit that's been lost, but also quite a bit that's been recovered in the years since I started writing the dissertation. Um, I think a few in terms of other surprises along the way, I guess one is the linguistic variety, and this applies to Chinese language and Chinese literature in general, but there's so much variety for the Chinese language, and it's such a rich language with such a long history that often it really feels like more than one language that I'm dealing with. And so I'm surprised to see sometimes how I can pick one book up and it's fine. I get right through it. I have no problem understanding it. And other stuff can be written in a style that's very unapproachable. And that happens for English too, of course, but as a native speaker, I think I notice it much less than I notice it with Chinese, which is a second language for me. So that's one of the surprises. I think the other surprise, to be honest, is what's happened since, where, as I said, I thought I was starting out with something that was very clearly limited and that I could cover all of in one dissertation and then one book, and it just completely exploded. And at the same time, contemporary science fiction by authors like Liu Cixin became incredibly popular. And so all of a sudden there's all this academic attention towards it, and there are all these movies coming out, and just in both the world of scholarly research and popular culture, it became this huge thing, and I never would have imagined that. Um, I guess maybe the biggest surprise of all is the fact that the book was translated into Russian, and here I am addressing an audience of Russian speakers. I think if I had ever imagined that, I probably wouldn't have been able to finish the book at all. But had I been able to get through it, I surely would have written a better book. Um, yeah. Uh, I guess the other question you had was about the Chinese tradition of wonderful tales and their influence on the tradition of science fiction. And maybe that feeds into one of the things I was saying about writing a better book. To try and limit what I was working with and have something with a clear beginning and an end, I really cut out a lot of uh, I didn't address that as fully as I think I could have. And that's a very big part. There's a very deep influence, especially from martial arts fiction in Chinese science fiction, both with sort of the weapons and the techniques, and also a lot of narrative strategies. And especially that was used in the late Qing Dynasty. But we see it in contemporary fiction as well. I think this is similar to, fantasy and science fiction in the Western world are very hard to define clear lines between. And this is the case in China too. And I think for Chinese readers, borrowing a lot of these tropes, makes science fiction much more approachable. It makes it much more familiar. And it uses a familiar vocabulary that people are able to understand from the get-go. Um, in terms of Western models, at the time, I write a little bit about the role of Jules Verne in Chinese science fiction. H.G. Wells is another person who was very important. Arthur C. Clarke later on is translated quite a bit. Uh, I think the big factors that motivated this in many ways are sort of their popularity in the West, and probably especially their availability in translation. And the more translations that were out there in English, or the more editions that are out there in English, uh, often leads to more translations into Chinese. Another factor is the translation into Japanese, right? Because Japan is often sort of a gateway for a lot of forms of knowledge and a lot of literature into China. So Japan, played a very important role, and that's something in my research now that I'm looking into more that I find really fascinating is that role of Japan as a conduit for science fiction and for other ideas into modern China. Um, yeah, in terms of science fiction's role, reflecting a state of a society in crisis, I would say that many of these authors' writings did transcend the realm of literature. And it went both into other writing, essays and other sort of utopian forms of writing, thinking about how society should be shaped. And it had a very deep influence on other academics and on social and political figures. a lot of these people were really actively involved in writing and thinking about how a new government would be shaped as the imperial period came to an end in China. And they weren't just science fiction writers by any means. And I would say in general, there's this category of literature at the turn of the 20th century called 新小说 or new fiction. And really, in some ways, I think a different way to approach the book would have been to think of science fiction as a subcategory of new fiction, and where everyone is thinking about how fiction can change society and how fiction can transform political life. And I mean, this is one of the things that makes me feel very much at home in studying Chinese literature and very justified is that um, from its earliest origins and certainly the turn of the 20th century and even now in the Xi Jinping era, literature is seen as central to political discourse and as a very important way to change Chinese society. I think in the United States anyway, we can see literature and art as perhaps unimportant or politically disengaged. And that's never been the case in China. So Chinese science fiction in many ways was very central to China's emergence as a modern nation state, and it still plays a very important role. As far as my favorite works go, I would say turn of the 20th century. One of the works that I look at in the book and that I translated into English myself is New Tales of Mr. Braggadocio, La 新法罗先生谈 which I think illustrates a lot of what I'm trying to talk about in the book. If I had to have someone read just one chapter, it would probably be that chapter. And it's just this fascinating process of something that we see as being kind of new, right? Where works of literature transcend genre and transcend international borders. And it sort of seems almost like a form of fan fiction, right? Where a German work of literature is translated into Japanese, and then that's translated into Chinese, and then a sequel is written to that. And really quickly we lose track of any sort of, original, authentic book that it was based on. But in the meantime, it's just so fun and so wild and all over the place. So it just does so much of what fascinates me. Contemporary authors, I think I would have to say Han Song is one of my favorites. He's been compared to Kafka a lot, as a Chinese sort of science fiction Kafka. I find him very macabre and also just, really fascinating, really strange. He always deeply affects me when I read his work. So he's probably my contemporary favorite. Yeah, I think that about answers most of the questions you have. Do you have other questions for me?